Please support this channel by subscribing. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep creating stories like this. She had learned how to survive by becoming invisible. Not the magical kind of invisible, just the kind that kept you alive in a palace full of immortal predators who treated humans like background noise. Elara Vale carried a silver tray through the Moonstone Palace with the same rules stitched into her bones. Eyes down, steps silent, breath quiet, never attract attention. The council chamber waited ahead, all marble and cold light, where vampire nobles argued over borders and bloodlines as if human lives were just numbers on paper. Today was worse than usual, because today King Alaric Noctir would sign the treaty that bound the kingdom to Lady Seraphina of the Northern Bloodline. A marriage the court called peace, and the servants called a cage. Elara didn't care about royal cages. She cared about her mother's medicine, the kind that cost half her wages, the kind that kept the cough from turning into a grave. Invisibility meant safety, and safety meant she could keep sending money home. She reached the towering doors just as Counselor Varen's sharp voice sliced through the room, snapping orders at servants like they were furniture. Ink, fresh parchment. Red seal wax, now. Elara slipped inside and felt the air change, heavy with power and arrogance. 12 council members sat in a semicircle around an obsidian table, their fine clothes dark as midnight, their eyes bright with hunger and status. At the head sat King Alaric, lounging like a man bored by his own throne, devastatingly calm, his presence so dense it made the room smaller. He looked as if the world had never surprised him once. Elara did what she always did, place the ink and parchment exactly where they needed to be, then stepped back into the shadows, hoping to dissolve into the wall. The treaty lay open, thick vellum covered with signatures and clan seals, months of negotiation pressed into fragile paper. Your Majesty, Counselor Varon prompted with a stiff bow, if you would simply sign. Alaric's gaze stayed on the window where storm clouds gathered over the city. I understand what signing means, he said, his voice clipped and cold. Binding myself to a woman I've met twice for the sake of northern stability. Thrilling. A few nobles shifted, but no one dared laugh. The king finally reached for the ceremonial quill, and Elara's heart slowed. Almost done, she thought. She could leave. She could disappear again. Then Varon snapped, Girl, the red ink. His Majesty prefers red for formal signatures. Elara's stomach dropped. The red ink was on the far side of the table. To reach it, she would have to pass behind the king's chair close enough that his scent, sharp and ancient, could hit her like smoke. She moved carefully, telling herself it would be seconds, just seconds, then she'd be gone. She stretched for the crimson bottle, and her boot caught on a loose stone in the marble floor, slightly raised like a trap that had been waiting for her. Time slowed. The tray tilted. The ink bottle slid, clinked once against crystal, and shattered. Red ink exploded across the treaty like a wound opening. It soaked through signatures, drowned seals, and ran in thick streams off the table to the floor. The chamber went so silent, Elara could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Her hands shook as she stared at what she'd done. Months of diplomacy ruined in one heartbeat. In her head she saw the punishments she'd heard whispered about whipping in the courtyard, the dungeon, exile to the blood farms outside the city. Counselor Varon lunged at her with his hand raised, rage tightening his face. You clumsy human. But before he could strike, Lord Darius Renfell, the youngest noble on the council, stepped between them. He moved smoothly, like someone trained to protect without making it look like defiance. It was an accident, Darius said calmly, and he pointed to the raised stone. The floor is damaged. Maintenance failure. Not her fault. Elara's throat tightened. No one defended servants. Not like that. Darius lowered his voice just enough for her to hear. Are you hurt? She couldn't even answer properly. "No, my lord," she whispered, shame burning her cheeks. Varan snarled. "She destroyed the treaty." Darius didn't flinch. "Documents can be rewritten." "The girl is terrified. Don't make a spectacle." Then a single word cut through the argument like a blade. "Enough." King Alaric spoke without raising his voice, yet the room seemed to shrink around it. Alara felt the weight of his attention shift, not like a glance, but like gravity. "Clear the mess," Alaric ordered flatly. "Have the treaty recopied. We sign tomorrow." Varan stiffened. "Your Majesty, surely there should be discipline." Alaric's tone dropped into something dangerous. "Or would you prefer to waste more of my time debating the fate of one servant?" The counselor bowed, swallowing his anger. Alara sank to her knees, fingers trembling as she gathered broken crystal and soaked parchment scraps, trying to make herself small. Darius's hand hovered near her shoulder, then pulled back, as if even kindness had rules here. As the council members filed out in murmuring speculation, Alara dared a brief glance toward the throne. King Alaric was staring at Lord Darius with a tight jaw and eyes like storm-dark glass, the kind of look that didn't belong in politics. Then, for one impossible heartbeat, the king's gaze shifted and met hers. Alara's breath caught. It wasn't indifference. It wasn't boredom. It was sharp, searching, almost angry, like she'd stepped into a place she didn't have permission to exist. Then he looked away, stood, and swept from the chamber without another word, leaving Alara shaking in the silence, realizing something she couldn't explain had changed. That night, she learned the most dangerous place to be was finally seen. By the next morning, Alara understood that invisibility, once broken, never truly returned. Whispers followed her through the servant corridors like smoke, curling around corners and slipping into every room before she arrived. Some said the king had spared her because he was distracted by wedding nerves. Others said Lord Darius had spoken for her behind closed doors. And a few cruel voices suggested she had done something shameful to earn mercy. Alara kept her head down and worked harder than ever, scrubbing ink stains from marble that would never fully forget the spill, changing uniforms twice to avoid recognition, telling herself that survival meant endurance. But the palace felt different now, heavier, as if something unseen had shifted. Even the guards watched her more closely, their gazes lingering with curiosity instead of dismissal. When her half-day arrived, she welcomed it like oxygen, trading marble halls for narrow streets and familiar smells of bread and wood smoke in the human district. Here, she belonged. Here, no one bowed or demanded silence. She bought medicine for her mother from the old apothecary, counting coins with careful fingers, relief washing through her when the woman smiled and said the cough was improving. It was the first good news Alara had allowed herself in days. She stepped back into the street, lighter than she had felt since the council chamber, already planning a quiet meal and a few precious hours of peace. That peace shattered when a familiar voice spoke her name with warmth instead of command. Lord Darius stood near a fruit stall, his fine coat out of place among warm cloaks and market carts, his expression open and unguarded. Alara's heart jumped into her throat. Nobles did not come here without reason, and reasons were rarely good. She curtsied awkwardly, heat flooding her face as passers-by stared. Darius smiled, not the thin, polite smile of court, but something genuine. He asked how she was holding up, if the palace gossip had become unbearable, and his concern felt almost unreal. When she thanked him for defending her, her voice shook despite her efforts. He waved it away gently, saying justice mattered more than appearances, then surprised her again by offering to walk her home. Alara wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she was fine, but refusal felt dangerous in a different way, so she nodded and walked beside him through streets she knew by heart. He asked about her work, about her mother, about how long she'd lived here, and listened as if her answers mattered. When they reached her building, he produced a small bundle of herbs, already paid for, saying the apothecary mentioned what her mother needed. Ilara's eyes burned. No one outside her family had done something kind without wanting something in return. She tried to refuse, failed, and whispered thanks that felt too small for the weight in her chest. Darius left with an easy smile, and Ilara stood there clutching the herbs, grateful and deeply uneasy, because kindness like that came with consequences she couldn't predict. She didn't see the shadow across the street, didn't notice the tall figure standing perfectly still between two buildings, eyes fixed on the place where Darius had stood. King Alaric had followed without admitting it to himself, telling himself he was inspecting the city, telling himself it meant nothing, even as he watched the noble make her smile. That smile cut deeper than any insult. He felt something hot twist in his chest, something ugly and possessive that had no place in a king who had ruled for centuries without weakness. He told himself it was irritation at Darius's presumption, told himself he had no claim on a human servant he had never spoken to, but the lies rang hollow. When Ilara disappeared inside, Alaric remained in the shadows, fists clenched, aware that he had crossed an invisible line he could never uncross. Back at the palace that evening, he tried to bury himself in reports, but her image kept intruding ink-stained hands, bowed head, that brief spark of courage when she met his eyes. When a servant mentioned her name in passing, the sound of it tightened something in his chest. He dismissed his counsel early, paced his study like a caged predator, and realized with a cold, sinking certainty that another man's kindness toward her had awakened something dangerous inside him. And while she walked home grateful, the king made a decision that would ruin her life. The night of the engagement feast arrived wrapped in candlelight and false smiles, and Ilara felt the tension before she ever stepped into the grand hall. The palace buzzed with anticipation for the treaty signing scheduled at dawn, nobles from rival bloodlines filling the corridors with silk, jewels, and sharp glances that weighed alliances like weapons. Ilara moved along the edges of the celebration with practiced care, refilling wine glasses, collecting empty plates, and keeping her gaze lowered as the music swelled and laughter echoed against crystal chandeliers. At the head table sat King Alaric beside Lady Seraphina, the woman who would soon be his queen. She was flawless in the way only ancient vampire nobility could be, pale and elegant, her smile controlled and calculating. Her hand rested possessively on the king's arm as she laughed at a counselor's joke, while Alaric himself looked distant, his wine untouched, his attention scanning the room with restless impatience. Ilara told herself she was imagining the way his gaze passed over her more than once, lingering just long enough to make her pulse quicken. She focused on her work, reminding herself that she was nothing here, that survival meant silence. Then Lord Darius stood from his place among the nobles and raised his glass. The music faded, and conversation died down as eyes turned toward him, curiosity flickering at the unusual interruption. Darius smiled warmly and proposed a toast not to bloodlines or power, but to the servants of Moonstone Palace, whose labor made nights like this possible. A ripple of surprise moved through the hall. Praising servants was not done. Ilara's hands froze around a wine pitcher as Darius continued, his voice clear and sincere, singling her out by name, commending her dedication and dignity despite recent difficulties. Heat rushed to her face as hundreds of eyes swung toward her, the weight of attention pressing down until it was hard to breathe. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Lady Seraphine's smile sharpened, her eyes flicking from Ilara to Darius with icy calculation, while murmurs spread like sparks through dry grass. At the head table, King Alaric went utterly still. His fingers tightened around his wine glass as something dark and volatile flickered across his expression. There was a sharp crack that cut through the hall, and crystal shattered in his bare hand. Wine spilled across the white tablecloth like blood, drawing gasps from the assembled nobles. Seraphina recoiled with a hiss of annoyance as crimson splashed her gown. Alaric rose abruptly, his chair scraping against marble, His jaw clenched so tightly the muscle jumped beneath his skin. He apologized curtly for the broken glass, but his eyes were locked on Darius with an intensity that chilled the room. When Darius asked if he was all right, concern mixed with awareness, Alaric's voice dropped into something dangerously quiet as he warned against drawing unnecessary attention to palace staff. The rebuke was sharp, public, and unmistakably personal. Silence swallowed the hall. Darius bowed, his expression calm but knowing, and Seraphina stepped in smoothly, ordering the mess cleaned and the celebration resumed. Alara forced her legs to move, grabbing clean linens and approaching the head table with trembling hands. Up close, Alaric's presence was overwhelming, his injured palm bleeding where glass had cut skin that healed too fast to fear pain. When she offered to tend the wound, he hesitated, then extended his hand toward her, ignoring Seraphine's glare. Their fingers brushed, and a shock ran through Alara so strong she nearly dropped the cloth. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to his dark eyes searching hers. Confusion and fury, warring with something raw and unguarded beneath. Seraphina stepped between them, her voice cold as she dismissed Alara back to the kitchens, and Alara fled with her heart hammering, aware that every noble eye had followed that moment. Behind her, whispers flared, alliances shifted, and the future queen watched her with a predator's focus. By morning, the palace would call her a traitor, and the king would be forced to choose. Morning arrived with iron footsteps and accusations sharp enough to draw blood. Alara was barely awake when palace guards burst into the servant quarters, their armor gleaming, their expressions hard with purpose. They seized her before she could even tie her hair, shackling her wrists as shocked servants whispered prayers and backed away. The charge was treason. Documents had been discovered during routine security checks. Sealed letters hidden among cleaning supplies, written in careful script that accused Alara of passing information to rival clans, of deliberately sabotaging the treaty to destabilize the kingdom. She stared at the evidence in numb disbelief, recognizing nothing except her own name forged too neatly to be coincidence. No one listened when she tried to speak. Fear swallowed her voice as she was dragged through corridors that once ignored her, now echoing with judgment. Nobles gathered to watch, satisfaction and outrage mingling as if her downfall were entertainment. Lady Seraphina stood among them, perfectly composed, offering sympathy that felt like a knife pressed gently to the throat. Lord Darius pushed forward, demanding restraint, pointing out the absurdity of the claims, but his protests only deepened suspicion, whispers blooming that he had been compromised, that kindness toward a servant had clouded his loyalty. Alara was thrown into a stone chamber beneath the palace, cold and damp, where light barely reached and time lost meaning. Hours passed, then more, until footsteps approached and the door opened to reveal King Alaric. He entered alone, his presence filling the space, his expression unreadable. The guards withdrew, leaving them in heavy silence. He held the forged letters in one hand, the seal of the northern bloodline glaring red against white parchment. He asked if she understood the accusations, his voice controlled to the point of cruelty. Alara shook, forcing herself to meet his gaze as she denied everything, her words tumbling out in a rush of fear and desperation. She spoke of her mother, of survival, of how invisibility had always been her shield, how she had never wanted power or attention. Alaric listened without interruption, his face a mask, but something in his eyes shifted as her fear sharpened into quiet resolve. He demanded the truth, not as a king, but as a man teetering on the edge of something dangerous. When the interrogation pressed harder, when exhaustion frayed her control, Alara whispered words she didn't recognize, sounds old and melodic, spoken instinctively in a language that felt carved into her bones. The air changed. Alaric went still, shock breaking through his composure as he recognized the ancient tongue, one known only to the oldest royal bloodlines, one never taught to humans. Silence stretched, heavy and charged. He ordered the guards back, ending the interrogation abruptly, locking Alara away, not as a condemned traitor, but as something far more complicated. Above ground, chaos rippled through the court. Seraphine's advisors assured her the plan was unfolding perfectly, that by nightfall, the girl would be dead or disgraced beyond saving. But whispers of the king's reaction spread unease. Darius was confined to his chambers under polite guard, his reputation questioned, his protests silenced. As night fell, Alaric stood alone in his study, staring at the city lights, the ancient words echoing in his mind. The evidence reeked of manipulation, of a trap set with precision, and his anger no longer knew where to land. If Alara was innocent, then someone had dared to move against her under his roof, had dared to test his authority and his restraint. He felt the fragile balance of his rule strain, jealousy twisting into something colder and more lethal. Then the king arrived, and his voice sounded like the end of the world. Alara woke to silence, so complete it felt unreal, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears and made every breath sound too loud. The stone chamber was different now, cleaner, warmer, the shackles gone from her wrists. But the guards outside the door were heavier armed than before. She should have felt relief, yet dread coiled tighter in her chest, because mercy in a palace like this was never simple. When the door finally opened, King Alaric entered alone again, his expression carved from control, his eyes dark with sleepless intensity. He did not accuse her this time. He asked her to speak, slowly, carefully, about the words she had whispered during the interrogation. Alara shook her head, terrified, insisting she did not know where they came from, that they had simply slipped out when she thought she was about to die. Alaric studied her as if she were a puzzle that defied logic, then ordered wine brought for himself and water for her, an imbalance so small, yet so telling that it made her hands tremble. He questioned her about her childhood, her parents, her grandmother, about stories passed down, songs hummed without meaning, phrases repeated like prayers. As she spoke, fragments surfaced, memories she had never questioned before, of lullabies her mother couldn't explain, of an old woman in the human district who once told her she had old blood courage and laughed it off. Alaric listened, piecing together something that made his jaw tighten. When she denied again that she was a spy, that she had never written those letters, he believed her, not because the evidence was weak, but because the fear in her eyes was too honest to fake. He dismissed the guards and leaned closer, lowering his voice as he asked if she understood what she had done by speaking that language. Alara swallowed and whispered no. He told her it was a royal tongue, older than treaties, bound to bloodlines that predated the kingdom itself, a language that should not exist on human lips. Panic flared, but beneath it was a strange calm, a sense that something she had carried unknowingly was finally being seen. Alaric ordered scholars, summoned in secret, men and women who bowed low and paled when they heard Alara repeat the words again, their shock confirming what he already feared and hoped. She was not just innocent, she was impossible. As night deepened, the truth became unavoidable. Alara carried a dormant legacy, one tied to an ancient pact between vampires and humans, a line thought extinct, a bridge meant to end wars, not start them. Above them, Seraphon began to unravel. Reports reached her chambers that the king had halted the execution order, that he had locked the girl away under royal protection instead of condemning her. Fury cracked her perfect composure as advisors scrambled to adjust, whispering that the situation was no longer controllable. Darius, released from confinement under watch, demanded answers and sensed the shift in power, realizing Alara's value was far greater than anyone had guessed. In his study, Alaric stood at the window while Alara rested under guard nearby, the city lights flickering like distant stars. The jealousy that once burned hot and reckless had cooled into something deeper and far more dangerous. Resolve. He saw now why he could not ignore her, why another man's kindness had felt like theft, why losing her, even to lies, had threatened to break him. She was not a weakness to be hidden or removed. She was a truth the kingdom had buried and could no longer deny. Alaric knew that protecting her would mean defying bloodlines, breaking alliances, and standing against his future bride, but the choice no longer felt like a choice at all. In that moment, the king realized she wasn't just innocent, she was destiny. Dawn broke over Moonstone Palace with a tension so sharp it felt like the kingdom itself was holding its breath. The council chamber filled again, not with celebration this time, but with suspicion, fear, and hunger for judgment. Lady Seraphina arrived dressed in mourning white, her expression carefully composed to signal sympathy and restraint, while whispers rippled through the nobles about the servant girl who had delayed a treaty and nearly fractured an alliance. Elara was brought in under heavy guard, her hands free but her fate uncertain, eyes lowered out of habit rather than fear. When the accusations were read aloud once more, the forged letters presented as proof, Seraphine's advisors spoke with polished confidence, arguing that mercy toward a traitor endangered the realm. Lord Darius stood to object, his voice steady despite the risk, but it was King Alaric who silenced the room with a single raised hand. He did not sit on his throne. He stood before it, shedding the distance of authority and facing the court as a ruler who had made his decision. He declared the evidence false, exposing the planted seals, the borrowed ink, the servants bribed to carry lies, and named Seraphine's inner circle as the architects of the frame. Shock tore through the chamber as guards moved, arrests made in full view of the court, the illusion of control collapsing in real time. Seraphina protested, her composure cracking as she accused Alaric of madness, of risking peace for a human nobody. That was when he spoke Alara's name, clearly and without hesitation, acknowledging her legacy and the ancient pact hidden in her blood. Scholars confirmed it, their testimonies sealing the truth. The room shifted from outrage to awe as the realization settled that the servant they had dismissed carried a bridge between worlds, a living answer to wars that had lasted centuries. Alaric ended the engagement publicly, dissolving the treaty and accepting the political cost without flinching. He ordered reparations for the human district, protections written into law, and the punishment of those who had abused their power, instant karma delivered not with cruelty, but with justice. When the court dismissed, he approached Elara not as a king towering over a servant, but as a man who had finally chosen honesty over fear. He offered her safety, education, and choice, making it clear she owed him nothing. Elara found her voice then, quiet but steady, saying she wanted respect, not rescue, and the chance to help both worlds without becoming a weapon. Alaric bowed his head in acknowledgement, a gesture that sent a shockwave through the watching nobles. In the days that followed, the kingdom adjusted to a new reality. Seraphina returned north in disgrace. Darius became a public ally of reform, and Elara moved through the palace no longer invisible, her presence altering conversations and laws alike. The slow bond between her and Alaric deepened through actions, not promises, through shared work, shared silence, and a respect that grew stronger than fear. When he finally reached for her hand beneath the moonlight balcony, there was no claim in his touch, only invitation. Elara took it, knowing the path ahead would be difficult and watched, but also knowing she would never again shrink to survive. And the girl who lived her whole life unseen became the only one the king could not live without.